Let me tell you something right now, and I want you to hear me loud and clear. When you walk into a room thinking you already know everything, life has a funny way of handing you a mirror and saying, "Look again." And that's exactly what happened the moment that young American girl stood up to challenge one of the calmest, sharpest, most composed men to ever sit at a global table, Dr. S. Jaishankar. Now, I ain't here to pick sides, but I am here to tell the story. And believe me, this ain't just a story. This is a masterclass in truth, power, and dignity. So this girl, full of that youthful confidence that borders on arrogance, steps up like she's about to set the world straight. Maybe she thought she'd rattle him. Maybe she thought India was still that soft, spoken country people used to walk all over. She started speaking real slick, tossing around words like human rights, freedom, and democracy, like she was the final judge on what those words mean. She came with that tone, the one that says, "I'm here to educate you." Oh, but she was about to get educated in a whole new way, and let me tell you, Jaishankar didn't flinch. He didn't roll his eyes. He didn't raise his voice. That man just waited, like a seasoned lion waiting for the noise to stop before he makes his move. And when he finally spoke, it wasn't a clapback. It wasn't a roast. It was a truth bomb so heavy it didn't explode. It just settled into the room and rearranged the whole atmosphere. He leaned in and said something so simple, so cold, so raw, you could hear the spine of every listener straighten up. He said, "When you live in a glass house, you shouldn't be throwing stones." That was it, just like that. Boom. Every word carried the weight of 1,000 years of civilization. Every syllable laced with history, pride, and calm fury. That girl came with an opinion. He came with experience. She came with a script. He came with the truth. See, what folks forget, especially the loud ones from across the ocean, is that India ain't new to this game. This ain't some startup nation trying to impress the West. This is a civilization that's older than your textbooks can handle. A land where philosophies were written when the rest of the world was still figuring out how to start a fire. And Jaishankar, he ain't just a politician. That man is a bridge between the past and the future, and every time he opens his mouth, you feel the weight of 1 billion people standing behind him. He went on to say, "You talk to us about freedom. Where were you when we were colonized? Where were your lectures when our people were being enslaved, our culture erased, our voices silenced? You talk about human rights. Where's your justice for Iraq, for Afghanistan, for Libya, for generations of people who paid the price for your foreign policies?" And suddenly, that girl, so full of fire just moments ago, was quiet. Not because she was silenced, but because she was stunned. You ever see somebody get hit with a truth so real, they forget how to breathe for a second? That's what happened. The room didn't erupt. It didn't cheer. It held its breath, because what he said wasn't for applause. It was for awakening, and let's not act surprised. Jaishankar's been doing this for years. He walks into global rooms where everyone's playing chess, and he flips the board and says, "Let's talk about why we're even playing this game." He's the man who will sit in front of a G7 panel and remind them that the G7 don't run the world anymore. That the global south is rising, and India is leading the charge, not with bombs and threats, but with technology, diplomacy, resilience, and silence that speaks louder than noise. Now, I know some folks might say, why did he have to go so hard? Let me tell you why. Because sometimes the truth hurts. Sometimes the truth is uncomfortable, but it's always necessary, and what he delivered wasn't hate. It wasn't rage. It was a long, overdue reminder that India is not to be spoken down to. Not anymore. See, that American girl, she came from a system where narratives are bought and sold like fast food, where mainstream media tells you who's the hero and who's the villain before you've even heard the full story. But Jaishankar don't play that game. He don't wear the mask. He doesn't bend to make others feel comfortable. He speaks the kind of truth that makes people uncomfortable, and that's how you know it's real. He reminded the world that India's model of democracy may look different, but it works. That India's diversity isn't chaos, it's its greatest strength. That yes, there are problems, but they're India's to fix, not the West's to exploit. And most importantly, he reminded everyone watching that the days of Western condescension are over. What shook people wasn't just what he said, but how he said it, calm, clear, confident, no yelling. No finger pointing, just standing there like a mountain that doesn't move when the wind blows, because when you know your worth, you don't scream, you don't beg, you don't try to impress, you just exist in your power, and the world adjusts. And this ain't just about one girl or one conversation. This is about the global shift we're all witnessing. For centuries, the world was told who the leaders were. Power came from the West. Decisions came from Washington, London, Brussels. But now power is moving east. Influence is spreading south. And India is at the center of that storm. Not because it's making noise, but because it's making moves. And Jaishankar, he's the voice of that movement. He's the symbol of what happens when a nation rises, not with violence, but with vision, not by demanding attention, but by commanding respect. He doesn't ask for the microphone, he becomes the message. And let me say this ain't about disrespecting America or any other nation. This is about balance, about mutual respect, because the world doesn't belong to one voice anymore. It belongs to all of us. And if you're coming to the table thinking your way is the only way, you better prepare for a reality check, because men like Jaishankar are rewriting the script, and they're doing it in real time. I've seen a lot of speeches. I've heard a lot of clapbacks, but that moment, that exchange, was something different. It wasn't petty. It wasn't personal. It was spiritual. It was generational. It was the moment a young voice from the West met the ancient, unshakable wisdom of the East, and realized that talking louder don't make you right. And you know what? I hope that girl went home and reflected. I hope she looked up India's history. I hope she read about the partition, the struggle, the colonial trauma, the economic rebirth. I hope she saw that freedom ain't just about waving a flag, it's about surviving centuries of oppression and still choosing to rise with grace. Still choosing to educate instead of retaliate, because that's what Jaishankar did. He could have embarrassed her, he could have belittled her, but instead, he elevated the conversation. He didn't just shut her down, he lifted the veil. And when you do that, you don't just change minds, you change hearts. Now let me say something to the people listening who feel inspired by this. If you're from India, walk taller, speak louder, because your time is not coming, it's here. And if you're from anywhere else, especially the West, listen deeper. Understand that respect is no longer a one-way street. You're not the teacher in the room anymore. You're a student, too. The world is a classroom, and the syllabus has changed. We're in a new era, an era where intellect matters more than arrogance, where diplomacy is sharper than warfare, where leaders like Jaishankar don't beat the drums, they move in silence and still shake the world. So to that American girl, thank you, not for the question, but for the moment, because without that moment, we wouldn't have seen just how far India has come. We wouldn't have heard the kind of truth that wakes people up. And maybe, just maybe, that one uncomfortable truth bomb might be the spark that leads to understanding, because that's what real leadership looks like. Not dominance, not aggression, but clarity, conviction, and courage. And Dr. Jaishankar, he's carrying all three like a torch, and he just lit the fire that's going to burn through every outdated stereotype and every double standard this world still holds onto. So the next time you think about questioning someone like him, don't just prepare your argument, prepare your soul. Because when a man speaks with the weight of his people behind him, when he's fueled by truth and not applause, when he's rooted in a history that stretches beyond your maps. That man ain't here to play. That man is here to shift the planet, and believe me, he already has. This wasn't a debate. It was a diplomatic awakening for the West. See, for the longest time, global politics has been treated like a classroom with the West seated at the front, hands on the chalkboard, and everyone else made to sit quietly and take notes. The idea was simple. They lead, you follow. They speak, you listen. And if you try to raise your hand, they'd call on you only when it fit their lesson plan. But what happened in that room, between a seasoned diplomat from India and a bold but misinformed young American girl, marked the turning of the tide. Not because she was silenced, but because she was made to see the shift, the truth, and the weight of a civilization that no longer waits to be invited to speak. Jaishankar stood there not just as a representative of a nation, but as a reflection of billions who have been told their time was not yet. But what happens when the people you've been sidelining start building? What happens when those you underestimated start innovating, start organizing, and start walking into rooms without apology? You witness not defiance but arrival, and Jaishankar's words, calm and calculated, struck deeper than outrage ever could. It wasn't about winning an argument. It was about revealing a truth so undeniable that even those watching from across oceans sat up and realized something had shifted. The girl's question, like many before it, was laced with an all too familiar tone, accusation disguised as curiosity, superiority cloaked in concern. It carried that flavor of, we know better. Even though the track record of such knowing better is marred by wars, destabilizations, and hypocritical alliances. But this time, India didn't offer a nod or a diplomatic dance around the discomfort. No, Jaishankar hit back, not with personal attack, but with historical perspective, institutional memory, and the sharp edge of global realignment. That's what the West isn't used to, the formerly quiet nations developing not just voices but vocabularies, not just positions but power. He didn't need to be loud because truth doesn't need a megaphone when it's rooted in reality. He laid bare the contradictions. How can those who funded wars in the name of freedom preach peace? How can those who supported dictatorships in the name of stability question democratic processes that look different from theirs? How can a nation that still battles its own racial and social inequalities stand as the beacon for others? These were the questions he didn't even need to ask directly. Their weight was embedded in his every sentence. The West has grown accustomed to shaping the narrative, but now they're facing leaders who aren't playing their game. And that's the awakening, because diplomacy is no longer about smiling and shaking hands while suppressing truth. It's about stepping into rooms with a spine and calling things for what they are. And that moment with Jaishankar, it was surgical. It was like watching a master dismantle a centuries-old myth without breaking a sweat. He didn't bring fire, he brought precision, and with each word he peeled back the layers of comfort the West had wrapped itself in. It marked something deeper than just verbal pushback. It marked the birth of India's assertive military doctrine backed by innovation, because that confidence on the mic doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from knowing what's standing behind you. A defense structure that's no longer dependent. A technological backbone that's growing faster than most acknowledge, and a leadership that's not seeking validation, but is instead charting its own course. That's why his words held power, because they were backed by preparation, by progress, by a nation that no longer needs permission to rise. This wasn't about shaming a young woman. It was about lifting the veil on a very old imbalance. A world order where those who had colonized and conquered now act as moral teachers, forgetting the wounds they've left open. But the thing is, India remembers. It remembers the silencing, the looting, the rewriting of its story. And now, with voices like Jaishankar, it's telling that story on its own terms, in its own tempo, and the world has no choice but to listen. What made the moment so impactful was its restraint. He didn't interrupt her. He didn't demean her. He waited, and then he responded with something she wasn't expecting: reality. Hard, inconvenient, and undeniable. He reminded her that India doesn't need lectures from countries that have historically chosen profit over people, strategy over sovereignty. He reminded her that democracy isn't a franchise with a Western headquarters, it's lived experience, and India, with its billion people, chaotic beauty, and resilient spirit, knows democracy in ways textbooks can't teach. When Jaishankar speaks, he's not just representing current India, he's channeling ancient India too, a civilization that was solving mathematics before others had a written script, a culture that knew the cosmos before maps were made. That gravitas doesn't scream, it sits, it observes, and when necessary, it speaks with a calm that silences the noise. That's what happened in that moment. The noise stopped. The world listened, not to dominate or disagree, but to understand that the age of one-way conversations is over. The real power of what he said wasn't just in its truth. It was in its timing. The West is now facing questions it's never had to answer before. Nations that used to stay silent are now building alliances, building tech, building economies, and building narratives. And when that kind of shift begins, it isn't loud, it's subtle, but when it shows up, it's unshakable. And that's what his words carried, the force of a new global psychology where power is no longer predicted by military bases or television networks, but by clarity, by character, and by consistency. That girl didn't just hear a man speaking. She heard a nation rising, not in opposition but in affirmation of its place in the world. And while she may have come with assumptions, she left with questions about history, about perception, about what she's been taught. That's the sign of a true awakening. Not that someone is convinced, but that someone begins to question what they thought was unquestionable. India is no longer looking to fit into Western narratives. It's writing its own, and it's doing so with a kind of quiet strength that doesn't ask for permission. Because when a nation has lived through colonization, partition, wars, poverty, and still manages to build, to educate, to innovate, and to lead, it no longer answers to those who once wrote its destiny. This awakening didn't happen overnight. It's been building quietly through policies, elections, satellite launches, border defenses, and global partnerships. And now, when a moment arises where someone tries to belittle or misunderstand, the response isn't emotional, it's clinical. It's strategic. It's a reminder that India's place at the table isn't a favor. It's a fact that young American voice will not be the last to challenge India. But from now on, those voices will know they're not entering a monologue. They're entering a dialogue where their assumptions will be tested, where their knowledge will be expanded, and where their privilege will no longer go unchecked. That's not aggression, that's equilibrium. And as the cameras rolled, and social media clipped the exchange, and the news cycles scrambled to spin it, it became crystal clear. This wasn't just another Q/A. It was the beginning of a global realization. That India's silence all these years was never weakness. It was patience, and patience, when it breaks, doesn't scream, it redefines. The West is beginning to see that the world it shaped no longer revolves around its axis. That leadership doesn't always wear a suit and speak in English. Sometimes it wears a kurta and speaks in truths that echo through centuries. And while that may be hard to digest for some, it is liberating for many. Because when one voice rises like that, it gives permission to others, to Africa, to Latin America, to Southeast Asia. It tells them, your story matters, your voice counts, and you no longer have to edit your pain or your pride to make others comfortable. Speak it, own it, defend it. And in that sense, Jaishankar didn't just awaken the West, he empowered the rest.